Hello and welcome to the Library of Congress. Thank you all for coming out today. My name is Deborah Thomas and I am the acting chief of the Serial and Government Publications Division here at the library. And we are responsible for newspaper collections at the library in the United States, as well as other kinds of periodicals and interesting things like comic books and things like that. And today we want to welcome you to the library and thank you for visiting us. And I hope you have the opportunity to visit our exhibits as well while you're here, including the In Her Own Words Rosa Parks exhibit, which is, I believe, downstairs, where you can learn, is it upstairs? Yeah. Sorry. Where you can learn more about Rosa Parks as a seasoned activist and her commitment to the civil rights struggle and obtaining social justice throughout her life. The role of journalists and the media in investigating and bringing these issues to light was and is a critically important one. And today we have a wonderful opportunity to learn more about one of the most important reporters of the civil rights era, John Herbers, through someone intimately familiar with his work and accomplishments, his editor and co-author and daughter, Ms. Anne Farris Rosen. Ms. Rosen is a Washington, D.C. based award-winning freelance journalist who has worked for the New York Times and the Washington Post. She also teaches news coverage of racial issues at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. For more than 30 years, Ms. Rosen has covered politics, government, legal affairs, and social issues at the national and international level. Her print and website experience includes writing for Newhouse News Services and newspapers in Arkansas, Missouri, and North Carolina. She wrote about the intersection of religion, politics, and the government at the Pew Research Center and the Rockefeller Institute of Government. Her broadcast experience at the international level includes working as an off-camera reporter for foreign-based television documentaries about the Clintons, American politics, Kosovo, Ireland, and Afghanistan. She's won numerous awards for her reporting on homelessness, teen pregnancy, judicial nepotism, and fraud by state officials. Today, Ms. Rosen will share with us her experiences working with her father, nationally acclaimed journalist John Herbers, on Deep South Dispatch, Memoir of a Civil Rights Journalist, which focuses on his coverage of the civil rights movement in the South during the turbulent 1950s and 60s. First for United Press International, and then for the New York Times. Born in the South during a time of entrenched racial segregation and brutality, Herbers witnessed a succession of landmark events that rocked the country, the world, and his own conscience, and fueled his courage and eagerness to share the truth. I'm pleased to introduce Herbers' daughter and co-author, Anne Farris Rosen, to discuss Deep South Dispatch, Memoir of a Civil Rights Journalist.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here. To me, this is the pinnacle of the book world, these hallowed halls of the Library of Congress. And as many times as I've been here, I spent a lot of time doing research for the book here. I'm always in awe of its beauty and significance among American treasures. So I want to give thanks to everyone who made this possible today. As you heard, the talk is sponsored by the Serial and Government Publications Division of the Library of Congress. Deborah Thomas, thank you, can hardly see you there, who's the acting chief of the Serial Division. And then there are others also at the division. Rosalind Waddy and Gary Johnson, our division reference librarians, and I want to thank them for helping. There's a display in the back of the room with a great collection of news articles about the civil rights movement, including some of my father's articles. So if you actually want to read the actual articles, you can see them back there. Michelle Wingfield, who coordinated the program for the Library Events Office. And my deepest thanks to Arlene Balkansky, another division reference librarian who believed in this book enough that she coordinated the talk and the display. So Arlene, thank you very much. Also, I want to thank a lot of friends and family who have come from all over the country for this, including my two sisters who are here today as well. So they can fact check me. I'm also very appreciative to be here in conjunction with this Rosa Parks exhibit. So it's across the Great Hall on the second floor, and I really urge you to take time to go and see it because it eliminates the full history of this well-known but really little known about seasoned activist. And there are rarely seen materials here that provide a more intimate view of her life. She was so far ahead of her time. And it comes through when you see the exhibit, you truly feel that. And it also inspires me, at least, to feel compelled to choose the moral imperatives in our own time. And I was struck by the importance of the exhibit, the importance they place on books, and how important they were in educating Parks and her husband, who had limited educational opportunities. Her husband learned to read on his own with help from his mother. He didn't go to a formal school till he was 10 years old. So books were the essence that really gave them a great foundation. So I think the exhibit underscores the importance of books and libraries in this wonderful place. I'm going to start today by showing a 3-minute video about Deep South Dispatch, sort of as an introduction.
A young reporter witnesses landmark civil rights uprisings in the segregated South he calls home. Yes, it upends the country, but it also shakes his consciousness, shakes his own world.
He began working as a newspaper reporter in Mississippi in 1949.
This is the story of John Herbers, a journalist for the New York Times and United Press International, whose assignment for more than a decade was to report on the civil rights movement in the Deep South.
Certainly it's a scene that nobody likes to see.
He reported on the brutal execution of Willie McGee, a black truck driver in Mississippi convicted of raping a white woman.
It received national and international news coverage.
And the murder trial of Emmett Till.
There had been other incidences like this in Mississippi beforehand, but this one shook the nation.
He interviewed icons such as Martin Luther King Jr.
We've gone too far now to turn back.
Robert Kennedy, and John Lewis.
This man here helped tell the story.
Who decades later met with Herbers again.
Thank you for all you did.
He took readers behind the scenes of the KKK, and he revealed the private grief of the parents of the 4 black girls who were killed in the Birmingham church bombing. And at his own personal risk, he covered the famous Freedom Summer murders, the riots in St. Augustine,
state officers had to use their police baton,
and the marches in Selma. In his book, Deep South Dispatch, Memoir of a Civil Rights Journalist, John Herbers offers vivid, first-hand accounts of seminal events in the history of our country. His vulnerability as a journalist allows readers to see how one man can remain dedicated to his Southern family and heritage, but also dedicate his work to exposing and rejecting the prescribed laws and mores of a prejudiced society. Upon hearing the not guilty verdict from an all-white jury in the Emmett Till murder trial, he wrote,
I felt a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. I hunched over the steering wheel and cried. I couldn't stop. I cried very cold.
I was born a black boy. My name is Emmett Till.
His retrospective is a timely and critical reflection on America's current racial dilemmas and ongoing quests for justice.
I came across for justice to be finally fulfilled, all because of me, a black boy. My name is Emmett Till.
So I like to call my father the Forrest Gump of journalism, because he seemed to be at almost every seminal moment in contemporary American history. He just popped up everywhere. He covered the civil rights movement for more than a decade for the New York Times and United Press International. He was a national reporter for the New York Times, and so he covered Vietnam protests, urban riots, the 1968 Democratic National Convention. He covered presidential campaigns, including that of Robert F. Kennedy. He was about 50 feet away from Kennedy when he was assassinated. He was the White House reporter under Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford. He covered Watergate, He wrote the Nixon Resigns front page article at that time. So he had quite a career, and you understand why I call him the Forrest Gump. About 20 years ago, he wrote his memoir, and it was only half finished. He relegated it to the bottom of a filing cabinet. About 10 years ago, I unearthed the manuscript, dusted it off, and suggested to him that we complete it. In order to do that, I delved into more than 600 of his articles. That was only up to 1965. And we worked side by side to produce the second half. Luckily, we finished it a year before he died in 2017. And he died 6 weeks after my mother died. He was in perfectly good health till she died. He just couldn't live without her. But both my parents really prepared me my entire life to help him write this book. Many times my father took our family with him. We were driven out of St. Augustine, Florida, in the middle of the night in the summer of 1964 by a band of armed supremacists, white supremacists. He and I were tear gassed right outside this window on the Capitol lawn when he was covering a protest. He took us to KKK marches. One summer we spent traveling to 16 cities around America that had been ravaged by urban riots. You know, it was an interesting childhood, let me just say that. This book only covers the civil rights movement. Didn't get farther than that. But he has his own Forrest Gump moments throughout, as you could see in the video. What's not mentioned there, too, of other places, he was 3 months after he joined the New York Times, he was dispatched to Dallas for the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He also covered the murder trial of Medgar Evers, and then there was a whole other series of events where he was a participant to witness that. So the book speeds along with really a firsthand account of these major historic events. But there's a deeper story here as well, and that is of a personal journey as a native son of the South, because he rejects the accepted mores and the laws of a segregated society while still trying to hold on to his heritage. So there was quite a conflicted dilemma here for him. It was an evolutionary process. He grew up in small southern towns where his church, his school, his family, the law, all endorsed a strict and uncompromising segregation of the races, and they perpetuated the prevailing wisdom that blacks were put on earth to be servants to whites. So he grew up in the Jim Crow South. He didn't question these teachings. Very few people questioned this. This was the status quo at the time. At age 18, he went to fight in World War II in the Philippines. And although he said there was never any good to come from war, there were some advantages for him. He discovered the joy of reading. He had access to libraries, and there was some downtime in the military, and he wanted to escape the boredom of that downtime. And he also became more worldly as he met people different from himself. He said it was the first time he had ever met a Yankee. And in fact, my sisters this morning showed me a letter. He was 18 years old. He was in Washington, D.C. as a young soldier. He wrote a letter back to his family describing how wonderful it was to be in Washington, D.C. He had never left the South before. And he said of all the sites in the capital city, he was most impressed by the Library of Congress. So I just thought that was a really wonderful circle of life to come back to today. He was also able to attend college because the GI Bill paid for college. His family could have never afforded to have gone to college. So when he returned to Mississippi after graduating from Emory University for his first newspaper job in 1949, he really saw his native homeland differently. And it particularly began with his assignment in 1951 to cover this execution that was featured in the movie of Willie McGee. Now, Mississippi didn't have a place to execute people at the time, so they had a traveling electric chair. You saw a picture of that big oak structure. They would go from county courthouse to county courthouse, put the chair in the courtroom, run an electric cord out the window and to a generator in the truck where they had used to deliver the chair. So let me just read to you from the book his witnessing of this execution. Get some water first, sorry. By 10 p.m., more than 500 people had gathered outside the courthouse. Most were men, some sitting in lawn chairs, who mumbled and laughed as they waited. The weather was pleasant and the scene festive. Boys and young men climbed to the top limbs of tall trees around the courthouse for a better view through the open window. I pushed my way forward to the front of the crowd. "Let's everybody be nice," a highway patrolman standing on the concrete courthouse steps said to calm the crowd. When he announced that McGee was going to die, everyone shouted a cheerful glee. "We want no demonstrations," the patrolman said. "You've been patient a long time." Those of us outside knew the execution had begun when the generator loudly kicked into gear. A cheer went up around the crowd around me. I felt sick as blood washed from my face. I looked around me and thought about how barbaric the scene was. There seemed to be an inordinate amount of cruelty in those times, perhaps because people had just come out of the brutality of World War II. But whatever the reason, the meanness was so immediate that it resonated deeply with me. So this was really the first in a series of articles that he would write about race that began to have an impact on him. You saw also the next one was covering the trial of Emmett Till, and you saw, how that impacted him as well. This was not an easy journey for him. He risked his safety and his standing among society, among his family, his friends. He and my mother were ostracized in their community for the types of articles that he was writing. And he wrote, again from the book, he says, "At times it seemed that the entire state of Mississippi was racist, and that everyone around me believed something different from what I did. Their beliefs and actions were reinforced by tradition, religion, and most importantly, the law. I would rise every morning and ask myself, is there something wrong with me?" But throughout all this, he had this deep moral conviction that his role was to bear witness and tell the world. He believed we should all be questioning our role in the world at any given time. Although the book is a historic retrospective, it's relevant, perhaps more so today than it was then. James Baldwin wrote, "History is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us, we are our history." That is never more true than today. So where are we today? I think if we look at our history, there's somewhat of an answer. Bear with me just a moment. We'll do a little history lesson here. The country has witnessed 3 major attempts to rectify the injustices that were wrought by slavery. The first was a strong but small drive by small farmers in the South who wanted to bar the importation of slaves because it was more advantageous to the large plantation system, and they were being overrun by the large plantation system. And they were effective enough that in 1807, the federal government did bar the importation of slaves. It did not end slavery, as we know, And the slaves in the North were then just brought down to the South for bondage there. But it was, in some ways, 2 steps forward and then 1 step back. The second major movement came after the Civil War, during Reconstruction. It brought major advances for African Americans, especially voting rights. 1,500 African Americans were elected nationally during Reconstruction. 200 of those were in Mississippi. Mississippi had 2 black U.S. senators. In New Orleans, black students were allowed to attend school with white students. Blacks could sit on any streetcar, anywhere they went, unlike Rosa Parks. And there was interracial marriage. But obviously, this growth of power among now black citizens in this country challenged the white establishment. The federal government was not as aggressive in enforcing this newfound freedom, and the Jim Crow laws were enacted in the South. So again, it was a series of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Martin Luther King was 26 years old in 1955 when he was recruited as a reluctant leader of the third movement, which we now know is the Civil Rights Movement. That movement ushered in national laws that altered every institution in this country, and it really did open the hearts and minds of white Americans, much more so than in the past. Our nation is now poised at the threshold of a 4th major movement. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, unfortunately the list goes on. Those are the new Emmett Tills. The shootings in the Charleston Church and the Pittsburgh Synagogue, those are today's Birmingham. Our current leaders' cries for white supremacy mimic the segregationist clarion calls of the 1950s and the 1960s. Charlottesville, the rally there, resembles what my father wrote about at these KKK rallies. Hate has once again reared its ugly head and become acceptable again. So why are we seeing this new surge of conscientiousness about race in America after such decades-long law? Couple of reasons that I theorize. First is demographics. In 20 years, whites will no longer be in the majority in this country. That's unprecedented. And it's not very far off. The majority of people in this country will be a collection of people of color, whether it's Asian, African American, Latinx, Native American, mixed race, people who identify within many of those. So the country is changing. Secondly, a survey of American landscape today makes it clear we did not see the civil rights struggle through. Our lack of perseverance and vigilance in the last 5 decades to uphold the standards of the civil rights legislation has left us with a list of systemic institutional inequalities. We have disparate funding and resegregation of schools. We have a high incarceration rate among African Americans. It is 5 times that of whites. And we have a racial wealth gap in which white families' average wealth is 7 times greater than that of black families. So change is being demanded. Third, we're in the midst of our own backlash of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. All around us, we see the influence of people of color in our society. We have leaders in business, arts, academia, sports, government, politics. I mean, we elected our first black president. Yet we're now witnessing a rise in demonstrative racism, anti-Semitism, and ethnic hatred. And we have a reversal of progressive policies that are generated and perpetuated by our leaders at the highest level of office. Fourth, we have new modes of communication and information that allow for voices of change. You no longer have to be a reporter for the New York Times to record and relay injustice. And it's forcing all of us to have what has been a deferred conversation about race in this country. It's a extremely interesting and difficult time to be alive. It's a dynamic time to be alive. But it's not often that you see yourself standing in the midst of history and watching history. But that's where we are right now. Your children and your grandchildren are going to ask you, where were you during this period? What were you doing? What was it like? So I think we're all confronted with our own version of my father's conversion. Perhaps not as drastically, maybe so, but even in small portions. So I hope this book really is a tool to remind us that talking with and listening to someone different from us, be it race, religion, or locale, we can find common ground. The sharing of stories with integrity, fairness, truth, it's an integral part of understanding each other and finding our way forward together. So in closing, because I really want to hear from you all and entertain questions, I hope the book will enlighten and also provide a platform of encouragement as we struggle with racial issues in America today. So thank you for coming. So, what do you think? Questions? Sorry, it's kind of hard for me to see. Oh, yeah. I've got all these lights. It's hard for me to see. Sorry.
Thank you for that talk. Do you know if your father got any backlash from the New York Times or UPI for writing some of the stories that he wrote?
He did not, from UPI or the New York Times. It's a great question, because you're right, the editors also have dictate over what stories are covered. However, before he worked for UPI, he was at the Jackson Daily News, another small publication in Mississippi, and he got a lot of pushback from the white establishment. They didn't understand why he was writing these sorts of articles. The press was as segregated as everything else, and these were white-owned newspapers, and they didn't want to have any news about blacks in their paper, even if it were good things. The editors at UPI did not give him any pushback, but UPI was a wire service like Associated Press with clients, be it newspapers or television stations or radio stations, and they paid for the news service. So he got a lot of pushback from his clients. They did not want these sorts of stories to be published, and they weren't interested in paying for them. They didn't want it as part of their package of articles they were paying for. And so that's where he and my mother in Mississippi were really ostracized by the community. And there's a couple of chapters that details how much resistance he got from the other news organizations in the city who were subscribing to UPI.
Also, when he saw these events, did he come home and talk to the family about them?
You know, he did not that much. When he came home, it was really a sanctuary to get away from those things, because they were quite tumultuous, as you know. And he was really, I think, trying to find refuge from that. Because he was so busy with this, we didn't get to see him very much, and so he took us with him. And so we didn't hear about it that much when he came home, but we sure saw it when he took us out right there in the field with him.
And a final question, did he have any friends?
Any friends? Well, that's a good question, and he says in the book that they didn't have a lot of friends. They didn't belong to any clubs. They found friendship and fellowship in their church, but not always. Sometimes they had to leave even the church they were associated with because they were ostracized there as well. He said, but in the process of losing those friends, he made other friends. And so he befriended Medgar Evers and his wife, not real close, because my father was a very objective journalist. He didn't hobnob too much with his sources. But he went to his home one night. He went to another reporter's friend's home last night, and Medgar Evers was there. And so he did socialize with him. But he met other people in the civil rights movement. But no, he didn't have a lot of friends. He was too busy, and when he came home, he was really dedicated to his family, too. So I don't know that he would have had a lot of time for friends. But great question. It was pretty lonely sometimes. When he came to Washington, D.C., he had a lot of friends. Yeah.
So I hung on every word in this book, just so you know.
Well, she also childhood friend, and she knew my father, so
yes,
that.
But what was so helpful to me reading this book was for the first time, I really understood how thorough the segregation was, and how that was a tool of control. And even the journal, your father explained so well that the black journalists wrote for black publications and the white journalists wrote for white publications. So what we read was, and it helped me understand how I had grown up in the South without knowing more about all of this. Because
right.
So I think that was so, but I was, I had a thought too when I was going through it, because I thought the book was also a loving tribute to your mother, such a wonderful tribute to her, and how important she was. They were a team, right? And I thought, also I heard a little bit in your father, I don't think he's explicit about this, but about women and their uncompensated work, right? That since he'd been exposed to the inequality among races, he was also sort of viewing, I think, gender in a similar way. Do you think did you sense that when you were working with him?
Oh, yes. He had quite a regard for my mother and for the role of women. He could not have done this without my mother. He got all the headlines, bylines, and she stayed home with 4 daughters, but he could not have accomplished what he did in his career without her. And he was overtly cognizant of that and really expressed that to her very much. But there was a lack of role of women, and he and John Lewis, as you saw in the film, meet for the last time for him in 2014-15, I believe. And John Lewis talks about his regret that women were not given more responsibility and credit for their role in the civil rights movement. And he says he wasn't really blaming the church, but he said, we organized the movement from a church, within a church. It came from the religious preachings. And the church was run in a more patriarchal hierarchy. And so he said, we didn't really think about it. But now, all these years later, he regrets that there was not more involvement among women. And there were some fantastic women in the movement. And my father really speaks very highly of Fannie Lou Hamer, sorry, I was pronouncing it incorrectly, who was a real stalwart. She was just such a shining light in Mississippi during that period. And there are others he writes about as well. Annie Cooper, who was brutally beaten by the police in Selma when she's trying to vote. So yeah, he does recognize women in the book too for what they did.
I can't think of anything more timely or more important of a message to hear now with what's going on in the country, as you've mentioned. And I'm always fascinated by that person who hears the need to listen to change or to know that perhaps all they knew was wrong. So what do you think it is that made your father different from the people he grew up with? Like, how did lots of people have gone off to war and come back the same racist they were when they went. So what do you think is your message or his message through you or what you observed that, where did that come from, really?
Yeah, he describes it a bit because that evolutionary process is not simple. And so he does detail that in the book. And it's not just hearing and knowing something's wrong, but changing and doing something about it. Although, he contends he was not an activist because he was such an objective reporter. His role was just to report what was happening. But I've had other journalists say to me, now he was an activist, especially in Mississippi when they didn't want these sorts of articles being written. But speaking more specifically just on his personality, I think it's part of in his DNA somewhat. He describes his ancestors, and his grandmother was, a product of the Victorian period, and she was shot and killed in the lobby of a fancy hotel in Hot Springs, Arkansas, by her lover, and she was married at the time. She had been divorced. And then he turns the gun on himself and kills himself, the lover. I mean, it's this lurid, horrible story, but that woman must have been a force of nature in the Victorian era, one, to be divorced, two, to have an ongoing affair with her while she's married to another man. So there must have been something going on there just in the DNA level. But he also attributes it to his upbringing. These small southern towns, he said, were very parochial. But they were what he calls cocoons of security and flourishing independence. I mean, these are little country kids running through clover fields, the idyllic scene that we all think about, we wish our children could still grow up in America. He really does attribute it to being a free thinker and the independence that came with that. But then also, he was a very religious man. Both my parents were very religious. And that religious upbringing, you're right, though, could have been used, as many in the South did. The suppression was biblically based. But he never really wore his religion on his sleeve. He just felt it so deeply. And I think from that comes a sense of injustice. It's not easy to explain, and I almost feel like he doesn't even completely explain it in the book, to be that much of a vanguard and a maverick that he was. But I really give thanks that he was. Yeah.
I just wonder what happened to the readership of the New York Times in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. Did it increase or decrease?
There was not a great deal of readership of the New York Times in the South. There would be some very prominent, rich, well-to-do people who might, but you couldn't even get it. I mean, right. The publications like the New York Times were not always national at that time. It has really become a national newspaper. But the New York Times was very important in influencing Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act, influencing Johnson, the president at the time, and influencing other reporters who would be coming into these scenes in the South and documenting them as well, especially television. So, most of the American public was not awakened to what happened during the Civil Rights Movement by reading the New York Times. They were watching it on TV every night in their living rooms. Scenes they never thought were possible in America, they didn't even know existed in America before. And it really began with the Emmett Till trial. He describes the hordes of media who were there, cameras, and that story was being disseminated all over the country. And I just want to say, too, the black press was very responsible for covering the Emmett Till story and getting the white press to become aware of that story. They would have probably never been there had not Emmett Till's mother displayed her son's body in an open casket, brutally beaten beyond recognition and bloated also because he was dredged up from the bottom of the Tallahassee River. Jet magazine, a black publication, was the one responsible for disseminating the photographs and the news story about that, and that's how the rest of the nation and the rest of the white press caught on to that story. So there was a great significant role of the black press, but they were horribly segregated, even in the murder trial for Emmett Till. At first, the black reporters were not allowed in the courtroom. The sheriff stood in the doorway and said, "We don't want any, use the N-word in our courtroom." And the judge said, "No, they have to be allowed in." They put them at a card table, all huddled around a little card table in the corner. And the next day, they gave them a little bigger table. But any blacks in the courtroom, including Mamie Till, including the Congressman Diggs from Chicago, they were all seated at one table. If there were blacks in the courtroom, they were up in the, just like you see in the To Kill a Mockingbird movie. So, sort of a rambling answer, but you get me started.
Thank you. You mentioned a couple times that as a child you were taken with your father to report on some of the events. So I was wondering, how old were you? What did you think when you saw it? How did that affect your friendships with other children back at home?
Yeah, the first one I remember was when I was 4, and we went to all-black church in Mississippi, out in the cotton field, because they were the stirrings of the civil rights movement was really starting in Mississippi, and it was because meetings were being held in churches to figure out how to get voting rights. There's a long description of they really had no rights at all. There were poll taxes. They had to count the number of jelly beans in a jar in order to register. They had to answer questions about the U.S. Constitution none of us could ever answer, probably. And so they really had no representation. That's why the juries were all white. The juries were selected from a voting pool, and blacks essentially were just not allowed to vote. So they were having these voting rallies, and I remember that was the first one that he took us to. I remember being at a KKK rally, and it was surreal because they were marching in downtown Atlanta, and they had their wives and children with them, and the children had on hoods and robes as well. And it just seemed strange to see little kids wearing those. It was an interesting experience. I don't remember it being an impediment to me being with other kids. We moved every year. That probably had more of a... We moved with the story many times, but my mother was really incredible. She was probably too Pollyannish about it all. She's like, okay, new house to hang curtains in, and get out there and make some new friends. And, you take your cues from your parents many times as a child. And they didn't make it seem like it was, at least to me, didn't make it seem like it was burdensome. My sisters may have a different version. But when we lived in Atlanta, we were just there for 1 year. We went to an all-white school, but there were 4 black children, and they were the sons and daughters of Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy. They weren't in my class. I was not friends with them. This was 1962, so Brown versus Board of Education had already been, ruled on, but schools, even in the North, were not, integrated. So anyway, yeah, interesting upbringing. Yeah.
As a young child, with your father going to these events, were you aware of the significance and the importance that this can have on history?
Perhaps not in the historical context, and he was not overly dogmatic. He's not like, watch this, and that's wrong, and this is not good, and he didn't do a lot of that. You didn't really have to. I mean, it was a pretty visceral feeling that something weird was going on. But there were educational moments. We were coming home from my grandmother's house. She lived in Mississippi. We were visiting her. And he pulled the car over and turned to the four of us in the back seat and said, "I don't ever want to hear you use the N-word. It is not allowed." And, of course, I had to be the one to counter that. I said, "Well, grandmother uses it," and that's why he had pulled us over. He pulled the car over, and he said, "That's true, grandmother does use that word, but she's my mother." I said, "Why don't you tell her not to use it?" He said, "She's my mother, and you always respect your mother." And this part was interesting. Some people's minds can't be changed. So I guess it was kind of a choose your battle type message. So there were moments when, the whole scene and setting was used to teach his children. Yeah.
Well, I have to wonder if with all this tremendous emotional experience that your father was having reporting this, if he didn't share this at the dinner table, tell stories that informed his kids what was going on in the world and what his role was in it. Can you say about that?
He was one of the most self-effacing people I have ever known. This was not about him. The story was not about him. The story was about someone else. Even when I suggested to him that we complete the book ended with 2 paragraphs. The manuscript ended with 2 paragraphs about the Emmett Till trial. I was like, "Dad, what happened to the rest of the story here?" And he said, "Anne," and he was 83 at this point, and he's more interested in gardening and cooking that night. He said, "Anne, I've already written all of that." And that's what prompted me to go get the articles, because he had written, there were more than 600 articles, from 1949 to 1965. Every day, these dispatches from the South. And it was just an incredible amount of witnessing to take in. And I think by the time he had regurgitated all of that in a daily story each day, he was done talking about it. That's one thing. So just his character in not harboring it as something that was internally disruptive to himself, and then also just the process he was going through of reporting it each day. I think those were mainly the 2 reasons. And let me tell you, it was like pulling teeth to get him to even internalize, what he was feeling at the time. I'd say, "Wow, you saw this woman beaten and drug into a paddy wagon. How did you feel about that?" "Well, it was bad." I'm like, "Give me something here." So you know how I got it from him finally? I said, "Sit down at the typewriter and just give me 2 paragraphs about how you felt about that." And he would sit there with a, pecking hen and type out much more description of how it impacted him than he would verbalize. So that's what I resorted to then. I just kept telling him, "Sit down, give me 2 paragraphs." Did I see a hand?
You did, actually. You answered the question, which was about the manuscript rediscovering it, and why he put it aside. Did you sort of answer that?
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
But initially, you know, and when it was very front page news, everything was news. How did his writing change or journalism change after that front page news era was over? Did he keep writing about it, or did he change his focus, or more in depth? Or?
Yeah, he retired in 1985, so from the New York Times. So the big transition in news, which we've seen, you know, really in the last 20 years, it was just starting, but definitely had not impacted the New York Times. And he went on to try his hand at teaching, which he wasn't very good at, and he didn't like it very much. And he would write as a freelance journalist periodically for things like Governing Magazine, different publications where he could do a little more in-depth, long-term analysis and what does all this mean. He wrote a great chapter about the role of the press during McCarthyism after he retired. So just being able to sit and not report on a daily basis with that deadline, he really enjoyed doing that. And he continued that for about 10 years after he retired from the New York Times. So I don't know if that answers your question. He saw the change in journalism. He was one of the last people at the New York Times to get a computer. They forced him to do it, and you know, but he never liked it. And I would show him on my computer or my cell phone how the news was reported. And you know, this was 5 years ago. It's even changed since then. And he was fascinated by it. And he said, "Oh my gosh, can you imagine if I had a cell phone?" I mean, this is a guy looking for a payphone in cornfields, you know? He said, "This is amazing." And he was fascinated and saw the great potential for the technology in reporting and in journalism, but he really did not experience it as a reporter.
Yes, I have two questions. How did he develop his sense as to where to be at certain times during that time period? And are you writing more books about the things that he's written about?
Thank you. Great questions. Martin Luther King and his lieutenants were brilliant public relations strategists. They had a philosophy of passive non-resistance, which meant you didn't fight back, no matter how terribly you were brutalized. And so they would deliberately pick cities and towns where they would find the most virulent opposition, where they would find these horrible redneck sheriffs who lashed out at the protesters. That's why they picked Selma. That's why they picked St. Augustine. That's why they picked Birmingham. Because when they got that reaction and they didn't fight back, it was televised all over the country of white police officers brutalizing people who were showing up just to eat in a restaurant. And so Martin Luther King and his his lieutenants, as I call them, they would call my father beforehand and say, "We're headed down to St. Augustine. Congress is debating whether to pass the Civil Rights Act, and we need to reinforce to them why this act is needed." So he had a great relationship with them in getting that sort of communication. You might say, well, he was being, played by them, but he knew that's where the story was going to be. There were so many outbursts at the time that it wasn't hard to find one thing or another. And then many times he was assigned by his editors. But in Mississippi, when he was first writing these articles about the movement getting started, he would have the leaders of those movements. They got to know that he was the one to call. and they would, because he would cover their stories, so they would call him. You know, other than that, I don't know that he had any magical intuition, but he knew the South. He knew it well. He knew the territory. He knew where to go. As far as doing another book, there's so much more to his career. I'm not embarking on doing any more of, based on his reporting. I think I would love to, but I don't know, maybe it gets a little too daddy infatuation after a while. But it's the great historical events, so. No, he had a column in, on the small paper in Mississippi. But they were all very straight, here's the facts, ma'am. Even the columns were, they were not opinionated. And he disdained the celebrity status of News Today. He just couldn't stand Fox News or MSNBC or any of those reporters giving their opinions. He thought it was an insult to the American public. You should just give them the facts and then let people make up their minds from the facts. Obviously, he wouldn't have been very popular in today's media. Wouldn't have gone very far, I guess, in today's media climate. Great, thank you.
Thank you all for coming today and all of your attention, and thank you to Ms. Rosen for joining us and telling us about her work with her father. And I do encourage you to go visit the Rosa Parks exhibit if you haven't already, or the newspaper and current periodicals reading room, which is over in the Madison building, which is that's where our division is housed. And if you have reference questions, our reference librarians in the back would be happy to help you. And please do take a look at the display of materials that we've brought over from our collections to share with you some of the civil rights work that Mr. Herbers did. Thank you. Thank you all for your attention.